the negative side of the critic is that you respond to things in the outside world, like almost like a hair trigger. You criticize before it can, not always, but one response is that you respond to something before you know what it is. You take it at face value before you really get to know something or examine it more deeply. Hi everybody, time for another archetype video. This week I am doing the critic, sort of a cousin to the judge, but not quite. It has its own characteristics. And when you hear critic, I know that the tendency, I think, is to think of being critical and to think of someone who criticizes, which is an aspect of it, But think about what it is to develop critical sight, to develop the capacity to evaluate or to analyze something with scholarship or with your professional skill, to really what the greater aspect of the critic is really to have critical sight, to be able to see flaws, not so much in a person for the sake of criticizing them, but to actually be very discerning, to be very clear in your evaluation of something. And so that when you that's the very positive side of having a critical eye. And you want that critical eye in someone, for example, who's evaluating your health, or or an architect who's evaluating the flaws in a building. There's nothing is more valuable than having someone with a critical eye. It truly is an asset and not a liability. Obviously, that notion of like the critical eye, the capacity to evaluate with skill, can be in any profession, and it makes the professional, I think, that's what makes the professional, is someone who really has the capacity to see clearly and to evaluate beyond any personal bias, even though it's very difficult to shed your personal bias completely. I don't know that that's possible, but to even realize this is my personal bias, but that said, this is what I am thinking about this because of I see this side and I see that side. So the critical eye is an asset, not a liability. We have literary critics, we have music critics, we have film critics. I mean, what was that team? Siskel and Ebert, and they put film criticism on the map. And I enjoyed listening to them evaluate films, and I thought, what an interesting profession that is. So they were, in fact, the most positive side of being a critic, and that's I think they influenced the film industry incredibly, incredibly. Um, the I think if you know that that is part of your nature, if you know that that's an archetypal pattern, let me just say that I think being critical is probably a trait versus an archetype, a trait that everybody has to some extent. I know people who, one of the characteristics that people notice is that they're not critical, is that they're just very open, and it's a very refreshing part. But when we are critical by nature, by archetypal pattern, it could be quite difficult to deal with. And so I'm going to talk about the shadow side of that now. The negative side of the critic is that you respond to things in the outside world like almost like a hair trigger. You criticize before it can, not always, but one response is that you respond to something before you know what it is. You take it at face value before you really get to know something or examine it more deeply. And the thing about doing that, whether it's the criticism or to critically judge a person, or an opportunity or an idea someone might suggest to you, is that in doing that, it's like you parameter the person. It's like you freeze them in a frame, in a criticism, and you freeze them and they can't get out of it, because that's how you first assess them, and that's the box you put them in. And let me give you an example of something I think is very common, and I think we all do this. And that's that if you go to a restaurant and you have a bad meal, and no doubt that restaurant has served 1,000 million good meals, but you have a bad one, and that's it. You won't go back there. You won't give it a second chance. You freeze it in that, nope, I've had a bad, and it becomes a criticism of the restaurant, and you're not going back there. And that's all there's to it. And it's that criticism that just sticks with you. And every time you think about that restaurant, you go into that freeze that you have, and that's all there's to it. You're not budging. And that's what I mean about this critical. A criticism is like a frozen something, a freeze frame that you put a person in or you put an idea in. And it is a form of control. It's a form of deciding this is what that person is. This is what those people are like. This is what that is. And I'm not changing my mind. I won't let any new thought come in. So that's another thing that the critic, being critical, does, is that it freezes a situation, person, place, thing, event into this perception that you have, and you disallow anything else from coming in and softening your opinion, of putting in a different perception that could open your heart or open your mind. So a critical nature has so many drawbacks, and one of them is that it can limit your capacity to understand another person more deeply, or to even be open to new ideas, new places. I mean, I cannot tell you how many. I know somebody who's, and you're not going to believe this, but it's the absolute truth, whose diet consists of one type of pasta, pizza, and burgers. That's it. That's it. There is nothing else this person eats. Will not, someone suggested when he moved out to the country that he could have a garden. He said, what for? He said, there's nothing I would eat out of a garden. Can you possibly imagine it? But he is so critical of anything that is from a garden, that anything that is like a salad, vegetables, won't even consider it. Won't even consider it. So he has frozen himself in this perception that everything that is not a burger or a pizza is just not edible. Okay, that's a freeze. Now, Another thing that happens in the critical mind is that you convince yourself you know more than you do. Like, I know what's going on here. I know what this person is like. I know what this person is up to. I know exactly what they're going to do. You get to make up a narrative because of the criticism that you have about somebody. I know exactly what they're doing. You know nothing at all. You know absolutely nothing at all. And I remember this woman. I had to rush off stage because of a personal situation. She stopped me and she said, could I talk to you for a minute? And it couldn't. I had an emergency. And I said, I can't talk right now. But it was actually an emergency. And I got an 8-page letter from her telling me off, criticizing me because she had come so far to see me and da-da-da-da, and I didn't even have the time. I had an emergency. And that was how she froze me. Just, it's astounding with how we think. And it's not like I have not done similar things, but not quite that extreme. Not quite that extreme. So the critic has a way of freezing you in this negative space as a control mechanism that says if I criticize something, I can convince myself that I know everything about that thing. I know or that person, or even if you've ever been with someone and you know that you're suggesting ideas about, well, why don't you try this, or what about this, and you're met with one critical response after another. Well, that'll never work. This won't work. I've tried that. That won't. Da 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 da. It's just this battle with their inner critic that just doesn't stop. And there is just no way to get in there, to thaw them out so that a possibility that they have never even considered might come in. Which brings me to, I think, one of the most challenging parts of the critic in the shadow side, which is the inner critic. For all the criticism that you can launch toward the outside world, one of the most challenging is how the inner critic speaks to you. When that critic gets turned on yourself and gets blended into the voice of your inner self and speaks to you like, this isn't good enough. You'll never be good enough. You'll never be good enough. You'll never be tall enough. You'll never be thin enough. You'll never be successful enough. What will people think? What happens if you do? What if you get criticized? What if you get criticized? What if you're on the receiving end of what you're dishing out? What if this happens? What if that happens? The inner critic. What if you're humiliated? Now, I'm going to tell you that in my work, when I started in medical intuition, I started out thinking that the reasons people were sick was this idea of negativity and trauma. And this goes back to the 80s. What did I know? And I had so much to learn. But eventually, as the years went by, I realized that negativity and trauma, the things we see, are the most powerless. The most powerless. It's all of the sufferings we do not see that cause us the most suffering. It's all of the experiences that happen within us that cause us the most pain, like being humiliated. And by far, being humiliated is one of the greatest sufferings that a human being can go through, because it guts a level of power and trust that is essential to the scaffolding of self-esteem and self-respect. And it causes a person to feel that they are not capable of protecting themselves or trusting themselves. And if you can't trust yourself, how in the world will you ever trust anybody else? You won't. You'll become an incredibly insecure, needy person who's constantly in search of reinforcement from other people. Am I good enough? Am I this or that? Because you're that inner critic, that inner flaw just doesn't stop. And that fear of being humiliated again or being criticized just won't stop. And what often happens because of that, is that you can't hear your intuition. And this is when it really becomes a major league spiritual crisis, is when you cease, is when you are unable to hear your own inner self, your own guidance, where you have no idea, what do I do? Who am I? Where am I going? What do I believe? What are my values? When you have no sense of your inner, because your inner critic has so completely taken over that you don't even have the clarity to know enough, trust enough about yourself to know I may have a fear of being humiliated, but I do know that I want to be an artist. But I do know I want to be a writer. But I do know this. But I do know that. But I do know I'm a good person. You have to start knowing something about yourself. But if that critic has managed to destroy that, then what happens is that you feel like a shell of a person. And oftentimes you become critical of the outside world or frightened of the outside world because you do not know how to engage with the outside world. The role of your intuition, the role of your inner self, is to direct you on how to step into the outside world, of how to utilize your sacred tools, your creativity, your compassion, your love, your knowledge, the substance of who you are. In other words, your charism, your special grace in the outside world. And you're directed, you're directed every day. You're directed in all kinds of ways of how to use that grace. And it's not, and why I say you're directed is because the difference between intuitive direction and intellectual is an argument of logic. It's always an argument of like, should I do this? Should I not? Should I do this? Should I not? And like crossing the street. Should I cross it? Well, ooh, look, there's traffic. Or look at that, the light's red. I better not. I mean, it's logic. It's survival logic. Now, your intuition is a mystical skill. It's a mystical skill. And so it operates completely from a different realm entirely. And it doesn't have a watch and it doesn't have logic to it. It has, and here's another thing. It doesn't have the same motivation as your intellectual skills because it doesn't need, that's not its purpose. It's not going to duplicate what your intellect is supposed to do. Your intellect is all about your physical survival, your physical reasoning, your physical rationale, your capacity to maneuver in the physical world and to understand physical sciences and logic and to ascend on that path. There's no reason for intuition to duplicate that, but It operates on the same laws, but they're mystical laws. And so they're not bound by time and space the way physical science is. Intuitive sense is not bound by the limitations of what you see, hear, taste, smell, feel. So you can see somebody for the first time, and your five senses have a limited capacity to discern information about that person. So if you're critical about that person right off the bat, you're going to freeze them, you know. But your intuitive skill, your intuition can download an entire understanding of what's going on in that person, an entire understanding of that person's just been through a trauma. You may not get the details, but you may just get this understanding of what that person's been through, and that you may sense this person is terribly afraid of being criticized, is very fragile right now, and you can sense that. And then you may find that a part of you is responding by saying, be kind to them, say a kind word to them. And it doesn't make any sense intellectually, but your interior says, be kind to them right now. Just one kindness, even if you walk by and greet them. Now, if your inner critic is up and running, and if you can't hear that subtle level of constant guidance, then you'll say something like, what's the matter with that? You'll just be critical. You'll be critical of the world around you. And you'll have critical things to say of others. Why don't they just get a job? Why don't they just get a job? You won't see human suffering as part of the human experience, and except for the grace of God go I. You won't recognize how we are all in this together, and that the simplest acts of kindness that are not critical, that compassion is the opposite of criticism, make all the difference in the world. And that being critical of the world is, at the end of the day, a way of criticizing God, a way of saying, you have so screwed up. Look at this place. It's a shambles, and I hate my life, and I hate the people in it. And you have no idea what's really going on in the intuitive world, behind the scenes. You have no idea. And here's the thing, you're freezing it. In the critical nature, critical of yourself, critical of others, you are freezing it. You are actually freezing it in the criticism that you're holding. Like, this will never work, and I'm not good enough, and blah, 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 blah. People have said to me, well, how do I get out of, thinking I'm not good enough, da, 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 da. Well, nothing comes without effort. Nothing comes without effort. You just can't decide, well, someone's got to make that better for me. You have to make it better for you. You have to. And you will encounter your saboteur on this journey. And so what you have to do, you don't have to, what I would suggest you do is that you pick something that your voice is telling you, like, you'll never lose weight, you'll never this, you'll never do that. And what you do is you take one tiny morsel of that. Never. One tiny morsel. Don't go overboard. Just take one tiny morsel and say, you know what? I'm going to walk 1 block a day. I'm just going to walk, because the object is not how far you walk, how long you walk, but that you walk. But that you decide, this is about me building self-respect. This is about me developing, destroying this sense of self-loathing. This is about me no longer criticizing myself. And so I have to give myself something that I feel good about. So it's up to you to start doing something every single day. And you don't break that pattern, like William James said, suffer not one exception. That you do, and so you start walking 1 block a day, and as soon as you feel better, add 1 block. Do not go overboard, because you will, the saboteur, and you will win. And just say, I feel really good about this. I can do this. Because the object is to build trust and respect in yourself. And that defeats the critic. That defeats the critic. And little by little, as you feel better in yourself, the critic loses its capacity to harm you. Life starts looking better. Things that you stop fearing humiliation. You have to earn this. This is what it means to, it's like a spiritual path. You earn this. This is your inner gymnasium. You earn this. But believe me, this works. This works. It's an inner devotion. And you become devoted to, you know what? I'm just going to tell myself, I'm not going to eat sugar. I'll take something once a week, but that's it. I'm cutting back. There's no more sugar. Whatever it is, however it is, whatever makes you loathe yourself, criticize yourself, will make you criticize others, will make you loathe the world around you. That's the hole in the dam you want to plug. And start out small, because if you start big, it won't work. It's like my brother. He always goes, he decides, when this happens, I don't know how many times. That's it, I'm going to the gym. He decides he's got to get himself in shape. Yeah, So he goes to the gym and he does this incredible workout, and he does it like he goes out there, works for an hour, and just comes back and thinks, wow, that was incredible. The next day, half hour. Third day, the hell with it. Right? If he had done it with this way of, I'm going to go to the gym, I'll start out at a half hour, and I won't exhaust myself. I won't do what I cannot do. I will do what I can do. And then just build it to a place where he doesn't dread it, and work that way. That's how you do it. So, I hope you enjoyed this, everybody. See you next week.